Shalom, this is Reverend John Ferret, and I welcome you to this new podcast series, especially at this time of the year, on the fall feasts of the Lord. And in lesson 1, we learned they're not feasts, they're moedim. They're appointed times, like a date. Specific times on a specific day at a specific place. And in Leviticus 23, as we saw that in session 1, God says in Leviticus 23, verses 1 through 2, that these belong to Him. So it is somewhat a mistake to say that these appointed times, the way we call them feasts, are just for the Jewish people. This is God. This is the God of the universe. And these are His appointed times. So I urge you to listen to the first podcast on the fall feast, Rosh HaShana. It's entitled Yom Teruah. And indeed, this one is called Tzel Mashiach, the shadow of Messiah. But please listen to number 1 so you can get all of that background that you need as we continue on here in part 2. Part 2 of Rosh HaShana, Tzel Mashiach, the shadow of Messiah. So as we continue, we want to understand how Yom Teruah would have been done in the Second Temple period. And I use the word Yom Teruah, the day of the blast, which comes directly out of Leviticus 23, because as you saw in session 1, there is no words Rosh Hashanah. That is actually in Jewish literature called the Talmud, and we'll take a look at that in just a little bit. So in the Second Temple period, so we're talking about the time when the Second Temple was built after they returned from Babylon in exile, all the way through Jesus' day. That's the Second Temple period. And this moed, this appointed time that we call Rosh Hashanah, is called Yom Teruah, the day of the blast. So, one of the verses that we have in the Second Temple period that's important is Nehemiah. And we go to Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 1 through 2, and it talks about all the people gathered themselves together as one man into the broad place that was before the water gate. And they spoke unto Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Torah, which the Lord had commanded Israel. And Ezra the priest brought the law before the congregation. In actuality, he didn't bring the law before the congregation. It actually says Torah. Both men and women and all that could hear with understanding upon the first day of the 7th month. Wait a minute. The first day of the 7th month? That's Yom Teruah. Again, popularly known today as Rosh Hashanah. Now we go to verses 9 and 10 in Nehemiah chapter 8, and we read, And Nehemiah, who was the Tishchatah, and Ezra the priest of the scribe and the Levites that taught the people, said unto the people, This day, the first day of the 7th month, this day is holy unto the Lord your God. Mourn not nor weep. So it seems as in Nehemiah's day, Yom Teruah, the first day of the 7th month, was a day of celebration. Because we continue reading, For all the people wept when they heard the words of the Torah. Then he said unto them, Go your way, eat the fruit, and drink the sweet, and send portions unto him, for whom nothing is prepared. For this day is holy unto the Lord. Neither be ye grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. Wow. So indeed, the day of the blast, remembering the day of the blast, for them, in Nehemiah's day, it was a day of celebration. A day where you can say, For the joy of the Lord is our strength. Now, we do not have any more biblical confirmation of how this moed, this feast, if you would, was done in Jesus' day. So like I said, it seems like it was a celebration, possibly even a New Year's celebration, could actually be a carryover when the Hebrews entered the land after the Exodus and they forgot the Lord? We go to Judges chapter 2, starting in verse 10. The third generation completely turned away from God. And it seems as if when you study it, that most of Israel was not practicing God's commands, God's feasts, for many hundreds of years. They were there in a pagan land among the Canaanites. They started serving the Baals, the pagan gods, the Canaanite gods. And for the pagans, and it was not only the Canaanites, the seventh month was the new year. It was considered the end of the harvest and the beginning of the new agricultural year. Now, after 70 AD, after the second temple is destroyed, the festival began to be called Rosh HaShana after the writings of the Tananim, the teachers of Judaism, in that day. Now, the great Jewish philosopher Philo, in Jesus' day, he said the feast was Yom Teruah, not Rosh Hashanah. He never even used those words. He was writing in Jesus' day, and we have his writings. You can actually buy the writings of Philo in complete books. I have them in my library. He said it was the day of the great blast. And Philo, he said it must mean to remember Sinai, the intense blast of the Shofar that we read about in Exodus 19 at the time of the giving of the Ten Commandments, at the time when Israel entered into a deep covenant relationship with Adonai. So, Philo also says it must be related to the number 7 in some way, but he does not go into how. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing prior to 70 AD, he never uses the words Rosh Hashanah. He talks about the day of the blast, the day of the Shofar blast. And he said the first of Tishri seems to be part of the new year for business buying and selling. It was the new fiscal year, if you would. But he doesn't talk about as a spiritual new year. So these are two primary, actually three. We got the book of Nehemiah. We got the works of Philo, the great Jewish philosopher, writing in Jesus' day, and Josephus, the Jewish historian, writing prior to 70 AD, and probably more during Paul's day. So today, in Jesus' day, there's nothing related to Rosh Hashanah like today. Now, after 70 AD, things change. And all of a sudden, the word Rosh Hashanah, or the words Rosh Hashanah, is all of a sudden coming to be used. This is about the second or third generation after 70 AD. And Rosh Hashanah, the rabbis started suggesting rituals and practices. And many of those rituals and practices have come to our day today. Now, some of these traditions may have begun in Jesus' day, or maybe not. We don't know. These rituals and practices are in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the main body foundational work of the Talmud, and the Mishnah was started to be written by the rabbis almost immediately after the temple was destroyed. And it's basically all of the laws that were made up by the rabbis outside of the written Torah, outside of the written Bible. It was accomplished or completed in 200 AD. And so when we're reading the Mishnah, we realize it was not written in Jesus' day, but there are references to rabbis who lived in Jesus' day and even before. So, for instance, it's similar to this. We celebrate Thanksgiving, and it's a grave mistake to say, oh, the Pilgrims celebrated Thanksgiving. No, they didn't. They didn't call it Thanksgiving. They had a celebration at the end of the harvest season to bless God and thank God for his protection and his great provision. But they didn't do Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving comes to its own basically in the 20th century, in the 19th century as well, and it becomes a national holiday here in the United States. So the Pilgrims basically started it, and then it finally attained the name of Thanksgiving as it is today, just like Rosh HaShana. Now, the Jewish people today, they celebrate with many different rituals and practices. One good source to actually check this out is the website Hebrew for Christians, all one word, Hebrew, the number 4, Christians.com, and you can go there and look up Rosh Hashanah, and John Parsons at Hebrew for Christians will give you a wonderful, scholarly, very well written, very well researched background behind how it is celebrated today and all the different rituals and practices. One of the things that I learned from the Jewish people that really is I love it, and that is having apples and honey on Rosh Hashanah. And the apples and honey are to eat something sweet, and a fruit of the fall, because we are at the end of the harvest season here in the United States, and typically apples are going to be part of that fall harvest. So it's part of the fall harvest, and we eat apples and honey. And considering that Jewish people are talking about a new year, all right, they always say, let's remind ourselves that the apples and honey gives us a picture of, may we have a sweet, good new year, like the taste of these apples and honey. I love that. So, rabbinic Judaist practices probably were not done in the days of Yeshua. Most of them are made up by the rabbis, and there's nothing wrong with it. The church has a lot of practices that are made up by men, like Lenten candles. Or you might say Advent candles. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not in the Bible. It has a symbolic meaning. There are sermons that are developed about Lenten candles. There are sermons developed about Advent candles and so on. And there's nothing wrong with this. It is what you would say midrash of the Christian church in terms of adding specific things to our practices and our rituals. It's the same thing with the rabbis. Now, we should respect their practices, but you've got to be careful. Don't just do Jewish stuff since it is Jewish with no understanding of why. Let me give you an example. Today, not all religious Jews, but many religious Jews, many Orthodox religious Jews, they do an activity on Yom Teruah, Rosh HaShana as they call it, that's called Tashlik. And so Tashlik is this: they recite prayers and they put breadcrumbs in their pockets, and they go to a river or a lake or a stream. And as they're reciting the prayers, they're taking the bread, and this is all a symbol of casting off your sins, which are carried away by the water. It's based upon this verse. So this was not done in Jesus' day, I can tell you that right now. But the rabbis in the Middle Ages made all of this stuff up, and they looked at a verse to justify this practice. It's Micah 7:18 through 20. You will cast all their sins into the depths of the sea, and may you cast all the sins of your people, the house of Israel, into a place where they shall be no more remembered or visited or ever come to mind. It's not biblical. This comes out of Eastern Europe from Orthodox Rabbinic Judaism. Matter of fact, in the 16th century, Rabbi Isaiah Hurwitz, he denounced it as an abomination. However, a couple of centuries later, the great Vilna Gaon, another great Jewish rabbi, he said no. So now we have two rabbis who are debating. One says yes and another says no. Now, when you study this practice and you go into the pagan culture of Northern Europe, prior to perhaps even when the Jews living there, it might be based on an ancient pagan ritual. That to cast your, you might say, sins, and they would be taken up by the demons in the lake or the demons in the stream. So it's like Halloween for me and my wife. I mean, when my kids were growing up, we did not practice Halloween because we knew Halloween had a lot of pagan foundation. And so it's very similar to this. But how many Christians today, especially Messianic Christians who are now in a Messianic congregation and doing the Sabbath on Saturday, and they're doing the feasts, etc., and they're going to do tashlich because their Gentile Messianic congregation leader only looks upon rabbinic Judaism and thinks that anything the rabbis say has got to be true. And it's not. Because all of this stuff on tashlich was made up in the Middle Ages. So, we avoid anything that may have been demonic, and we stay away from it. And so for me, I had a lot of difficulty when I was in Messianic congregations, and I knew this. And I knew that this practice may have been coming out of a pagan culture. So again, there are practices that are done in rabbinic Judaism that if you don't understand it, and if you don't grasp where this all comes from, don't just do Jewish stuff because it's Jewish stuff. We really need to understand where these things come from. Like an example, the rabbis say it's a 2-day feast, but God said it's only one. God said it's just the first day of the 7th month. The rabbis did a 2-day feast because they said, well, what if you're in a certain part of the world where you cannot see the new moon? Because again, this is the first day of a lunar month. This is the first day of the new moon. Will you see the new moon? Well, what if it's cloudy? What if you're in the midst of a 3, 4, 5-day rainstorm? You won't know that this is the day, this is the night of the new moon. So they said, let's have a second day. And the rabbis say in the Talmud that this is just as valid. Now, the Talmud, again, is the books of the commentary of the rabbis that was completed about 500 AD. There were other variations of it as it came out all the way to 900 AD. And in Judaism, the Talmud is on the same level as the Bible. So, in Judaism, there are many religious Jews who, when a rabbi says, we're going to celebrate the feast of Rosh HaShana for 2 days, and the second day is just as holy, just as sacred as the first day, they agree with this because it's in the Talmud. And the Talmud is on the same level as the Bible. As a Christian, I do not agree. Matter of fact, if you actually study the history of the Talmud, you'll find out there were many Jews that disagreed with this as well. When you study the Talmud, one of the things that you learn is the rabbis say that the written Bible, the written Torah, was given at Sinai, and the oral Torah was given at Sinai. The oral Torah is the Talmud. It's the Mishnah, and then the additional writings to the Mishnah, which are called the Gemara, and put that all together, and you get the Talmud. And the Talmud is as sacred as the Bible. They consider it's God-inspired. Now me, how do you get away with saying God is wrong? You're basically saying that. God said 1 day, and the rabbis say, no, sorry, Lord, it's going to be 2. It doesn't add up. Now when we go to Deuteronomy 12, verse 32, or when we go to Deuteronomy 4, verse 2, it's as if God is inspiring Moses to teach us, don't add anything to my word. Don't subtract anything from my word. And yet, this is what's done in the oral Torah. Another thing is the rabbinic feast, Rosh HaShana, is considered a Sabbath. But the Bible's precise. It isn't a Sabbath. And I just thank the Lord for Jewish Orthodox, rabbinic Jewish sites who will teach us, no, it's not a Sabbath, but we treat it like one. Because the specific laws of the Shabbat, the specific laws of the Sabbath are not associated with Rosh Hashanah, except that you're not supposed to do any work that day. So the rabbis could be creating a fence around Torah. Well, what does that mean? Well, a fence around Torah means Gee whiz, God said to do no work on the feast of Yom Teruah, which they call Rosh HaShana. So I got a good idea. Let's follow all of the laws of Shabbat for Rosh Hashanah. This way, we cannot in any way do anything to degrade the feast. Because if we're doing the Shabbat and we're doing all the laws of the Shabbat, we are doing over and above what God has demanded and commanded for this moed of Yom Teruah, Rosh Hashanah. So let's treat it like Shabbat, and we'll be safe in our practice. Now, this is an Orthodox rabbinic view. It's their decision. It's not biblical. However, I have no problem with it, especially like this one Orthodox rabbinic site that stated, no, Rosh Hashanah is not a Sabbath. We treat it like one. And the reason being is, therefore, we're safe in our practice, because if we're doing all the laws of Shabbat, we are not going to break any laws, anything that God commanded for Rosh Hashanah. So for me, I respect it and honor it. I know it isn't a Sabbath, but I definitely know it's God's special time. Now, Rosh Hashanah is first brought up in the Mishnah, and I told you that these were the books being written right after the temple was destroyed, finally completed in 200 AD. And the rabbis say it's the birthday of the universe. This is not said in Jesus' day at all. And in the Mishnah, we read about Rabbi Yossi. And in about 160 AD, in the Mishnah, you can read this, he said that God created the universe in 3760 BC. It's exactly quoted right out of the Mishnah. And so therefore, on Rosh Hashanah, the shofar is blown because that's when God becomes king of the universe. You'd say, well, wait a minute. I don't read this anywhere in the Bible, but this is what Rabbi Yossi made up. Matter of fact, when we're looking at it, and this year we're dating this podcast actually, this is the year 2021, and so Rosh Hashanah is coming up here in a few days, and it will start the new year on the biblical calendar or the Jewish calendar, and it will say 5,782. In other words, according to Rabbi Yossi, this September, this Rosh Hashanah, he would say that the world was created by God 5,782 years ago. Because if you take 3760 BC and add 2021 to it, you come up with 5,781 years since creation. Now, it's unbiblical and it's unhistorical. Just imagine, there have been Egyptian tombs found dated to 3300 BC. Huh? But Rabbi Yossi said the world was created, the universe was created in 3760 BC. But these Egyptian tombs found are dated to 3300 BC. 400 years after creation? That makes no sense. But that's real archaeology. That's real historical fact. An ancient cemetery was found in Poland. The ancient cemetery is dated to 3500 BC. You guys, that's almost 40 years before the creation. 40 years before. Rabbi Yossi had a creative imagination, yet this statement of his has really come down to our day. If you actually take a look at, there's a website called Hebcal, Hebcal, one word, hebcal.com, HebrewCalendar.com, and you can get the calendar for today. And so therefore, next Tuesday, and I don't know what day that's going to be, but Rosh Hashanah is going to be the 1st of Tishri, and the date of the year will be 5,782. It's still being used today, but it disagrees with archaeology. However, again, what is amazing to me when you put this in its historical context, you start studying the great Maimonides, the great Jewish scholar in the Middle Ages. He wrote in his own writings in 1178 AD, this great Jewish Torah scholar, that in 1178 AD was 4,938 years in creation. And so when you take these two numbers and you work with it, you come up to 3,760. So all of a sudden, Maimonides shows that he's agreeing with Yosei. Huh? But few Christians even know this, and the fact that these views are unbiblical and not historical. And when you actually take a look at real archaeology and real history, it just doesn't make any sense. So many of the current meanings of Rosh HaShana are all made up. They are figments of man's fertile imagination after the temple was destroyed. So for me, I always ask, where is Jesus? Where is Jesus in the Torah? Where is Jesus in the Hebrew Scriptures? Where is Jesus in the Old Testament? In the two podcast series, The Gospel According to Moses Genesis and The Gospel According to Moses Exodus, there's a couple of podcasts in there where I talk about the major goals of that Torah series. And one major goal is, where is Jesus in the Torah? How does the Torah testify of him according to John 5:39? Jesus says that all Scripture testifies of me, but he said it when the only Bible they had was the Hebrew Scriptures that we call the Old Testament. And the main books were the Torah. So this is where we want to focus. Because again, these feasts are not the Jewish feasts. These are appointed times by God. And he is the God of the universe. He's King of kings and Lord of lords. And the question also becomes, and once we see Jesus in these feasts, our question then, how can we as Christians actually participate in perhaps an evening of praise and singing and celebration on this feast called Yom Teruah, the Day of the Blast? So in part 3 of this series, let's take a look at perhaps some ways Jesus can be seen in this amazing, amazing Moed of Adonai, this appointed time of the Lord, Yom Teruah, that we know as Rosh HaShana.